We have standards here. Take your dog and leave.
You may not see my scars, but I carry them every day.
That man earned the right to sit here.
Restaurant manager kicked out disabled veteran. Then Navy SEALs at next table stood up. When Vincent Caruso told Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison to leave Bella Vista restaurant because of his service dog, he thought he was dealing with just another difficult customer. He had no idea that 4 Navy SEALs at the next table were about to turn his discrimination into a lesson he'd never forget. The golden hour light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bella Vista, casting warm shadows across the polished marble floors of what was considered the finest dining establishment in downtown San Diego. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and the soft murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle clinking of expensive silverware against bone china. This was a place where business deals were made over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, where politicians entertained donors, and where the city's elite came to see and be seen. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison sat quietly at a corner table, his service dog Rex lying calmly beside his wheelchair. At 29, Jake carried himself with the disciplined bearing of a career soldier. Though the empty space where his legs should have been told a story of sacrifice that most of the restaurant's clientele couldn't imagine. His dress uniform was immaculate, the ribbons on his chest representing 3 combat deployments, and a Purple Heart earned when an IED explosion in Kandahar had changed his life forever. Rex, a golden retriever trained specifically for wounded veterans, was more than a companion, he was Jake's lifeline. The dog could detect the onset of panic attacks, retrieve dropped items, provide stability during transfers, and offer the emotional support that made daily life possible. Rex wore his official service dog vest, clearly marked with patches identifying him as a working animal protected under federal law. Jake had chosen Bella Vista for tonight's dinner because it represented a milestone in his recovery. 6 months earlier, he wouldn't have been able to handle the crowds, the noise, or the social pressure of dining in such an upscale establishment. But his therapist had encouraged him to challenge himself to reclaim the life that the explosion had tried to steal from him. This dinner was supposed to be a celebration of progress, a quiet victory over the limitations that others tried to impose on him. At a nearby table, 4 men in civilian clothes sat enjoying their meal, their conversation punctuated by the easy camaraderie of people who had faced danger together. They were Navy SEALs from Team 5 in San Diego for advanced training exercises, taking a rare evening off to enjoy good food and each other's company. Their leader, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, had noticed Jake the moment he entered the restaurant. The military bearing was unmistakable, as was the quiet dignity with which he handled the stares and whispered comments from other diners. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the ugly reality of discrimination against disabled veterans, while demonstrating the unbreakable bonds of military brotherhood. Jake's evening had started with hope and determination. After months of physical therapy, psychological counseling, and the gradual process of rebuilding his life, he had decided to take a significant step forward. Dinner at Bella Vista wasn't just about the food, it was about proving to himself that he could navigate the civilian world with confidence, that his wheelchair and service dog didn't have to limit his experiences or define his identity. The reservation had been made weeks in advance, and Jake had specifically mentioned Rex when booking the table. The hostess who took his call had seemed knowledgeable about service animal accommodations, assuring him that the restaurant was fully compliant with ADA requirements. Jake had felt optimistic as he prepared for the evening, choosing his dress uniform both as a mark of respect for the establishment and as a quiet statement of pride in his service. Rex had been by Jake's side for 8 months now, a gift from a veteran support organization that understood the unique challenges faced by wounded warriors. The dog's training was extensive. He could sense the chemical changes that preceded Jake's panic attacks, providing deep pressure therapy and guiding him to safe spaces when crowds became overwhelming. Rex could also perform dozens of practical tasks, from opening doors to retrieving items that Jake couldn't reach from his wheelchair. Jake's strategy for the evening was simple: arrive early to avoid the dinner rush request, a table with easy wheelchair access, and focus on enjoying a meal that represented normalcy and progress. He had practiced the route from his apartment to the restaurant, timing the drive and identifying accessible parking. Every detail had been planned to ensure success, because failure felt like more than just a disappointing dinner. It felt like surrender to the limitations others wanted to impose on him. The first sign of trouble came when Jake approached the hostess stand. The young woman who greeted him seemed flustered by the sight of Rex, despite the dog's obvious service animal identification. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing nervously toward the dining room, But we don't allow pets in the restaurant. Jake patiently explained that Rex was a service dog, not a pet, and showed her the documentation he always carried. The hostess seemed uncertain, but eventually led them to a table, though not the quiet corner spot Jake had requested. Vincent Caruso, the restaurant manager, appeared within minutes of Jake being seated. A man in his 50s with the polished appearance of someone who had built his career on maintaining appearances. Caruso approached the table with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his authority unquestioned. His expensive suit and perfectly styled hair spoke to his position in the restaurant's hierarchy. But his expression suggested that he saw Jake's presence as a problem to be solved rather than a customer to be served. "Sir," Caruso said, his voice carrying the practiced politeness that barely concealed his true feelings, "I'm going to have to ask you to remove your animal from the dining room. We have health department regulations to consider, and other customers have complained about the dog." The statement was delivered with the confidence of someone who expected immediate compliance, but Jake recognized it immediately as both illegal and insulting. Jake's response was measured in professional drawing on the diplomatic skills he'd learned during his military service. He explained Rex's status as a service animal, cited the relevant federal laws, and offered to show the documentation that proved Rex's training and certification. But Caruso's expression remained unchanged, his mind already made up regardless of legal requirements or common decency. "I don't care what papers you have," Caruso said, his voice growing louder and attracting attention from nearby tables. "This is a high-end establishment, and we can't have animals disrupting our other guest dining experience. You'll need to leave immediately or I'll call security." Surnan. The confrontation that Jake had hoped to avoid was now inevitable, but he had no idea that help was about to come from an unexpected source. The tension in the restaurant became palpable as Caruso's voice carried across the dining room, drawing stares from other patrons who were witnessing something that made them deeply uncomfortable. Jake remained calm, his military training helping him maintain composure, even as anger and humiliation threatened to overwhelm him. Rex, sensing his handler's distress, moved closer to Jake's wheelchair and placed his head on Jake's lap, a trained response designed to provide comfort and grounding. "Mr. Caruso," Jake said, reading the manager's name from his badge, "I understand your concerns, but Rex is a federally protected service animal. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you cannot refuse service based on his presence. I'm happy to show you the relevant documentation and explain his role in my medical care." Jake's voice remained steady, but those who knew him well would have recognized the steel beneath the politeness, the same tone he'd used when addressing subordinates who had crossed lines in combat zones. Caruso's response revealed both his ignorance of the law and his fundamental lack of respect for disabled veterans. "I don't care about your documentation," he said, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "This is my restaurant, and I decide who gets served here. You and your mutt need to leave now before I have you escorted out." The word mutt hit Jake like a physical blow. Rex wasn't just a service animal, he was a lifeline, a partner, and in many ways the reason Jake was able to function in the civilian society. At the nearby table, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez and his 3 teammates, Petty Officer First Class Thompson, Petty Officer Second Class Martinez, and Petty Officer Second Class Johnson, had been following the confrontation with growing anger. These were men who had served multiple combat deployments, who understood sacrifice and brotherhood, and who recognized both Jake's military bearing and the injustice of his treatment. Rodriguez made the decision that would transform the evening from a moment of discrimination into a lesson in military solidarity. He stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and commanding, drawing the attention of everyone in the immediate area. At 6'2", with the lean, dangerous build of a special operations warrior, Rodriguez's presence was impossible to ignore. His 3 teammates followed suit, their synchronized movement creating an unmistakable show of force. "Excuse me," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command in life or death situations. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with this soldier." He gestured toward Jake with obvious respect. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs, and I think there might be some confusion about federal law regarding service animals." Caruso's demeanor shifted immediately when faced with 4 obviously military men whose physical presence and bearing suggested they were not people to be dismissed lightly. "This is a private matter," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence he'd shown when confronting Jake alone. "I'm handling a customer service issue." Thompson, a soft-spoken Texan whose calm exterior masked a fierce protective instinct, stepped forward. Sir, with respect, this isn't a customer service issue, it's a civil rights violation. This Marine has a federally protected right to be here with his service dog, and what you're doing is illegal. His words were delivered without aggression, but with the absolute certainty of someone who knew both the law and the consequences of violating it. The confrontation escalated when Caruso, feeling cornered and embarrassed by the public nature of the dispute, made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. "I'm calling the police," he announced loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "We have trespassers who are refusing to leave and causing a disturbance." He pulled out his phone with theatrical flourish, clearly expecting the threat of law enforcement to end the confrontation in his favor. Martinez, the youngest of the SEALs but a veteran of multiple combat deployments, couldn't contain his disgust. "You're going to call the cops on a disabled veteran for exercising his legal rights?" he asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Do you have any idea what this man sacrificed for your freedom to run this restaurant?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and other diners began to shift uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple restaurant dispute. The atmosphere in Bella Vista had completely transformed. What had begun as an elegant evening of fine dining had become a moral battleground, with Jake at the center of a confrontation that would test everyone's understanding of service sacrifice and basic human decency. Other customers began pulling out their phones, some to record the incident, and others to research the laws surrounding service animals, suddenly aware that they were witnessing either a grave injustice or a learning moment that would change their perspectives forever. Rex remained calm throughout the escalating tension, his training and temperament allowing him to provide steady support to Jake while the human drama unfolded around them. The dog's professional behavior stood in stark contrast to Caruso's emotional outburst, providing a visual reminder of the discipline and purpose that defined both military service and the animals trained to support wounded warriors. The arrival of the San Diego Police Department marked the crisis point of the evening, but not in the way Vincent Caruso had anticipated. Two officers, Sergeant Lisa Chen, a veteran herself, and Officer David Park, whose brother had served in Afghanistan, entered Bella Vista, expecting to handle a routine trespassing complaint. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a civil rights violation that would test their understanding of both law and justice. Caruso approached the officers with the confident stride of someone who believed his version of events would be accepted without question. "Officers, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward Jake and the SEALs. "These individuals are refusing to leave my establishment and causing a disturbance. I need them removed immediately." His tone suggested he expected immediate compliance, but Sergeant Chen's expression remained neutral as she surveyed the scene. What Chen saw didn't match Caruso's description. Jake sat calmly in his wheelchair, Rex lying quietly beside him, while four obviously military men stood nearby with the disciplined bearing of professional soldiers. None of them appeared agitated or disruptive. If anything, they seemed to be the most composed people in the restaurant. The other diners, however, were clearly upset not at Jake or the SEALs, but at what they had witnessed. "Sir," Chen said to Caruso, "can you explain exactly what happened here?" Her question was professional but probing, and her eyes took in details that Caruso had hoped she would miss: Jake's military uniform, Rex's service dog vest, and the obvious respect with which the SEALs treated the disabled veteran. Caruso's explanation revealed both his ignorance and his prejudice. "This man brought an animal into my restaurant, which violates health codes. When I asked him to leave, he refused, and these other men began threatening me." The lies came easily, but they were immediately contradicted by multiple witnesses who had recorded the entire confrontation on their phones. Rodriguez stepped forward with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to briefing superior officers under pressure. "Ma'am, I'm Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Navy SEALs. This gentleman is Staff Sergeant Morrison, and Rex is his federally protected service animal. Mr. Caruso has violated the Americans with Disabilities Act by refusing service based on the presence of a service dog. We intervened only to ensure that Sergeant Morrison's civil rights were protected." The crisis deepened when Caruso, realizing that his version of events was being challenged, doubled down on his position. "I don't care what laws you think apply here," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "This is my restaurant, and I have the right to refuse service to anyone. These people are disrupting my business and need to be arrested for trespassing." Officer Park, who had been quietly observing the interaction, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Caruso, Are you aware that refusing service to someone because of their disability or service animal is a federal crime? His question was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining basic law to a child, but the implications were serious. You don't have the right to refuse service based on disability status. The turning point came when other restaurant patrons began speaking up. An elderly woman at a nearby table stood and addressed the officers directly. "Officers, I saw the whole thing. This young man was sitting quietly with his service dog when the manager started harassing him. These military gentlemen only got involved when it became clear that the manager was breaking the law." Her statement was supported by nods and murmurs from other diners, many of whom had recorded portions of the confrontation. A businessman at another table added his voice to the growing chorus of support. "I've been coming to this restaurant for years, but I'll never eat here again if this is how they treat our veterans. This man served our country and lost his legs defending our freedom. The least we can do is let him eat dinner in peace." His words sparked a wave of agreement that rippled through the dining room. The crisis reached its peak when Caruso, faced with overwhelming evidence of his wrongdoing and growing public condemnation, made a final desperate play. "Fine," he said, his voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "If you won't remove them, I'll close the restaurant for the evening. Everyone needs to leave now." His threat to shut down the entire establishment rather than serve a disabled veteran revealed the depth of his prejudice and the lengths he would go to avoid admitting his mistake. But Sergeant Chen had heard enough. "Mr. Caruso," she said, her voice carrying the authority of law enforcement, "you have two choices. You can serve this gentleman and his service dog in accordance with federal law, or you can face charges for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. The choice is yours, but this confrontation ends now." The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the entire restaurant held its breath as Vincent Caruso faced a choice that would define not only his evening, but his future. Sergeant Chen's ultimatum hung in the air like a sword, while Officer Park documented the incident with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this case would likely become a teaching moment for law enforcement agencies across the country. Rodriguez, sensing that the situation was reaching its resolution, made a decision that would transform the evening from a confrontation into a celebration of military brotherhood. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, addressing Jake with the formal respect due a fellow warrior, "would you and Rex do us the honor of joining our table? We'd like to buy you dinner and hear about your service." The invitation was delivered with the sincerity of someone who understood that shared sacrifice created unbreakable bonds. Jake's response revealed both his gratitude and his grace under pressure. "Chief, I'd be honored," he said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "But first, I think Mr. Caruso has something to say." All eyes turned to the restaurant manager, who stood frozen between his pride and the reality of his legal situation. The preparation for what would become the evening's climactic moment began when other diners, inspired by the SEAL's example, started approaching Jake's table. A young couple who had been celebrating their anniversary offered to pay for his meal. An elderly veteran from the Korean War stood and saluted, tears streaming down his face as he recognized a kindred spirit. A businesswoman who had been dining alone asked if she could shake Rex's paw, explaining that her son was deployed overseas, and she understood the importance of service animals for wounded warriors. Caruso watched his restaurant transform from an elegant dining establishment into something resembling a military ceremony, and the reality of his situation began to sink in. The other diners weren't just supporting Jake, they were actively rejecting Caruso's authority and judgment. Several had already asked for their checks, making it clear that they would never return if the discrimination continued. The financial implications of his actions were becoming as serious as the legal ones. Sergeant Chen, recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond a simple law enforcement matter, made a decision that demonstrated both wisdom and compassion. "Mr. Caruso," she said, "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to do the right thing. Apologize to Sergeant Morrison, serve him and his service dog with the respect they deserve, and we can all move forward from this moment. Continue with your current course, and I'll have no choice but to file charges for civil rights violations." Certainly no. The climax began when Thompson, the quiet Texan SEAL, stood and began to speak about service and sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the restaurant, "I want you to know something about the man sitting at that table. Staff Sergeant Morrison didn't lose his legs in a car accident or a workplace injury. He lost them defending our freedom in Afghanistan, serving alongside men and women who understand that some things are worth dying for. His words created a hush that seemed to draw everyone in the restaurant into a shared moment of understanding. Rex isn't just a pet, or even just a service dog, Thompson continued. He's a lifeline for a warrior who gave everything for his country and is still fighting battles that most of us can't imagine. When you disrespect Rex, you disrespect every sacrifice that Sergeant Morrison has made for all of us. Martinez joined his teammate, adding his own perspective on the meaning of service. In the military, we have a saying, leave no one behind. That doesn't just apply to combat, it applies to how we treat our brothers and sisters when they come home wounded. What happened here tonight was an attempt to leave a wounded warrior behind, and that's something we can never accept. Sana, the emotional peak of the evening came when Jake himself stood, or rather raised himself in his wheelchair to address the restaurant. I didn't come here tonight looking for a fight. He said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about sacrifice. I came here to celebrate a milestone in my recovery, to prove to myself that I could still be part of the world I fought to defend. He paused, looking directly at Caruso. Mr. Caruso, I don't need your apology for my sake. I've faced worse than your ignorance and survived. But I do need your understanding for the sake of every disabled veteran who will walk through your doors after me. We didn't choose to come home wounded, but we did choose to serve. The least you can do is let us live with dignity. The climactic moment arrived when Caruso, faced with the overwhelming moral weight of the situation and the practical reality of his legal jeopardy, finally spoke. Sergeant Morrison, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I apologize. I was wrong. You and Rex are welcome here, and I'll make sure my staff understands the law regarding service animals. The words came reluctantly, but they came. But the evening's true climax wasn't Caruso's grudging apology. It was what happened next. Rodriguez stood and raised his water glass in a toast. To Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, he said, a warrior who continues to serve as an example of courage, dignity, and grace under fire. And to Rex, who proves that loyalty and service come in many forms. The entire restaurant rose as one glass's raised voices joined in recognition of sacrifice and service. As the applause died down and normal conversation resumed, Jake found himself surrounded by new friends and supporters. The evening that had begun with discrimination had transformed into a celebration of the values that define military service: honor, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between those who have served. Rex, sensing that the crisis had passed, settled contentedly beside his handler's wheelchair, his mission accomplished. The video footage of Jake's confrontation and the SEAL's intervention, recorded by multiple diners and shared across social media platforms, went viral within hours. The hashtag #StandWithJake began trending nationally, drawing attention not only to the specific incident, but to the broader issues of discrimination against disabled veterans and the importance of service animal rights. Major news networks picked up the story, interviewing Jake, the SEALs, and legal experts about the implications of the case. Vincent Caruso's apology, while legally necessary, came too late to save his reputation or his career. Within a week, Bella Vista's ownership had terminated his employment and issued a public statement condemning his actions. The restaurant implemented comprehensive ADA compliance training for all staff and established a partnership with local veteran organizations to ensure that wounded warriors felt welcome and respected. The corner table where Jake had been harassed was designated as the Warriors Table, reserved for veterans and their families. The legal consequences for Caruso extended beyond his job loss. The Department of Justice filed civil rights charges against him personally, resulting in substantial fines and a court-ordered requirement to complete sensitivity training and community service with disabled veteran organizations. His case became a landmark example of the personal liability that business managers face when they violate federal disability rights laws. Jake's story sparked legislative action at both state and federal levels. The Service Dog Protection Act strengthened penalties for businesses that discriminate against service animals and their handlers, while also providing additional funding for service dog training programs. The law was signed in a ceremony attended by Jake, Rex, and the 4 SEALs who had stood up for them that night at Bella Vista. The 4 Navy SEALs received commendations from their command for their professional handling of the situation and their exemplary representation of military values in a civilian setting. Their actions became part of military leadership training programs, demonstrating how service members should respond when witnessing discrimination against fellow veterans. Jake became a national advocate for disabled veteran rights, speaking at conferences and working with organizations to improve accessibility and understanding. Rex, now famous in his own right, became a therapy dog for other wounded warriors when not serving as Jake's service animal. Together, they proved that dignity, courage, and brotherhood could triumph over ignorance and prejudice, inspiring countless others to stand up for what's right when they witness injustice.